Bienvenidos, Ushamdid, and welcome Anne Arundel Community College learners from the CTS-233 Fall 2021 semester. This is the Cisco Networking Academy's DevNet Associate course curriculum, and this is for learners looking to prepare for the DevNet Associate CCNA level exam. Now, I'm going to be doing a number of videos breaking down Linux command line basics, and we're going to be examining commands that are going to be very important to not only your success in the course, but your success when you sit for the exam. And in this video, our focus is going to be laser-like and fixed on the ls command, one of the most important CLI commands in Linux, and that is simply listing out the contents of the current directory. So let's dive in. And the reason I'm breaking these videos down into individual commands is because there are many options that these commands come with, and we want to explore those options in detail. So here I am. The prerequisite for this is that you have either a terminal window opened up on your Mac or you have a virtual machine running. Now, I'm just simply running Ubuntu Linux here, and I've got a terminal window open in the VM. And now let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at the ls command. Well, the first thing we want to do is simply run it by simply typing ls and hitting enter. Now, you'll notice a few things here, and your mileage may vary if you're doing this on your Mac or on a different flavor of Linux. However, with Ubuntu, we get these blue listings here, and you can quickly determine by the name, and I did this intentionally to make it easy to follow along, that those are directories, and so those show up as blue. And then we have these white listings here, and you can see these are just simply regular files, or think of those as text files. But this one here is green. And what does that mean if it's green? Well, it so happens that that means that it has an execute permission bit set. And so it's been changed to green to differentiate it from these other files that do not have certain permissions set. Now, with respect to the ls command, what can we infer from the way that the output has been displayed? Well, when we look at this, we could come away with two things. We might think, oh, well, it lists the directories first, followed by the file names. And you could be right. However, you might also look at this and say, well, ls with no options is going to simply list out in alphabetical order all of the files. Now, from a Linux perspective, a directory is looked at as a file. And then a text file, right, or a regular file is looked at as a file. But directories are seen and treated as files in that Linux hierarchy, right? So remember that. So we see that this is listed out in an alphabetical fashion, but it's a little bit hard to tell. So let's go ahead, and I'm not going to go into the command itself, but it stands for make dir, and we're going to call this a dir. And now let's type ls and see what happens. And a dir is listed first because that is alphabetically the file name that would be listed first. Now, what if, and again, that still doesn't prove that it's alphabetically listing things out, because you might look at that and say, well, that's still a directory, then it's going to come first because their directories are being listed first. However, what if we did this? The touch command will allow me to create an empty zero length file. And I'll show you the zero here in just a second and why I'm referring to it as a zero length file, but we'll just say a file. Well, let's not do that. Let's just say AA file, because AA file would be listed before a dir, right? Because it's alphabetical, and it is. So our takeaway here is that ls, when used with no options, is going to list out the files in the directory, and I'm going to say the regular files in the directory in alphabetical order. So that leads to a question, well, what if I wanted to list them in reverse order? Well, ls has an option for that, but you might be asking yourself, Well, okay, that's great that you know these options. How do we learn about these options? And that is by using the man pages, and that's short for manual, right? So you would say man, and then the name of the command you're interested in getting more information about. So let's take a look at the ls command. And you can see here that it's going to give us an explanation, a description of what ls does, list information about the files, the current directory by default, right? So the directory in which we are in on the CLI, it is in that directory by default that we're seeing the files. It's not listing all the files in all the directories throughout all the file systems, right? And sort entries alphabetically. And again, sort entries alphabetically if none of those options or -- sort is specified. So again, ls by itself, we get it in alphabetical order, right? Now, here are some additional arguments, and we're going to be taking a look at this one here and this one here along with others, because this lowercase a or the -- all, and one of the questions learners ask all the time is, well, why do you have a -a or a -- all, right? What are the -- almost all, or -- author? Why do those exist? Well, these are commonly referred to as the long version of the option. This would obviously be the short because they're much shorter. And my personal preference is always to use the short ones because I'm really good at typos and I don't like to have to type out a whole bunch of things. And if I can shorten how much I'm typing, then all the better. The long option is also, you'll sometimes hear it referred to as the GNU options. The GNU, which stands for GNU, is not Unix. And I won't get into the history of GNU, but the reason they say GNU is not Unix is because Unix used to be licensed and people would pay lots of money to get the Unix operating system before Linux existed. And GNU came out with a lot of free things, right, that they were giving away. And so these are options that are commonly familiar with or commonly associated with GNU. But again, we'll call it the short option and the long option. And you can hit the return key, right, or the enter key on your keyboard, and it's going to take you down a page at a time, or you can do the space bar. And the space bar takes you down a page at a time. Again, the return key goes a line at a time, space bar goes a page at a time, and then we get down to this option right here, which is -L. Use a long listing format. And we're definitely going to be spending some time with that option. One more option that we're very much interested in is the -R. Reverse the order while sorting. And then you could come down here to the U. If we combine that with the -L and the -T, and we're going to talk about the T here in a second, with respect to what information the -T shows, and you can see right here, sort by modification time, newest first. And we're going to talk about the times. We're going to talk about a change time or ctime and what that means. We're going to talk about the modification time and what that means. And we're going to talk about the access time. So the times that we'll see when we use the -L option are going to give us some information about the file. When were the contents of the file last changed? When were they last viewed? When were they last modified, right? So these different ways to say things, and the time is very, very important. So it's that -T that we're interested in. So to get out of here, we could just hit Q. And Q cuts me out, and it's going to put me right back on the command line. If I want to clear my screen, by the way, you could simply type clear, right? So let's go ahead and say ls. And so here's all these alphabetically listed files. Let's first take a look at ls-r. Is this going to work? And it does. Look at that. It lists them in reverse alphabetical order. So let's take a look at the -L, because right now, all we've seen are the names of the files. And that might not be too helpful, right? Obviously, this shows me, okay, I've got these files in this current directory, but let's get some more information. Let's take a look at a long listing of the information about these files. And so when I say ls, remember by default, it lists them in alphabetical order because there's no R in here. What if I had said ls-rl? Well, then we get a reverse alphabetical listing of all the files. And so let me clear the screen and let's run the ls-l by itself. And then let's kind of talk about some of the different values that we see here on the screen. Now, let's talk about the first character here. Or maybe I should come from it from the left to the right. You can see it's a dash, and that means it's a regular file. And the definition of a regular file is that it is not a directory and it is not a link. If it was a directory, it would have a D, just like these 4 directories have right here. So D stands for directory when it's that first bit in what is listed here and commonly referred to as the permission bits. Because, and I'm not getting into permissions in this video, we'll definitely be looking at that in a different video because it's a very important concept to understand when you're dealing with Linux. But the permissions of read, write, and execute, that's what the RWX stand for, they mean something very different in the directory context when compared to a regular file context, right? So, but you have the next 9 bits refer to the permissions. Read, write, execute. Read, write, execute, read, and then you can see we have a dash, meaning that the write bit is not on here, and then execute. So you might be asking, well, why do we need that repeated 3 times? Why do we have read, write, execute, read, write, execute, read, write, execute? Well, let's look at it like this, and I'll change the color here to yellow. Think of it like this. The first 3 permission bits, RWX, these refer to the owner of the file. And the owner is who is listed here in this column, right? So Travis P. Bonfili is the owner. Those are the permission bits that apply to me. And then we have the next 3 permission bits. And these are for the group. And the group is what is listed after the owner. So you have the owner column here and then the group column. So if you're not the owner of the file and you're not a member of the group to which the file is affiliated, you would be, you see W a lot, right? And it stands for world, right? And you can think of it as everybody else, right? Because if you're not the owner and you're not a member of the group to which the file is affiliated, then you fall under the rest of the world, right? It's a great way to think about it. And so these would be the permissions that apply to anybody who is not affiliated with the group and who is not the owner. And so that's what we see here in this output. Now, the next important thing that we want to take a look at is our time column. And this becomes very, very important in the context of, well, I'm curious when the last time a file was accessed, and we need to define what that means. When was the last time a file was changed? What's the ctime? And what does that mean? And then when was the last time a file was modified? And you can think of modified as like edited. When were the contents of the file edited? So I'm going to do right over here on the right-hand side, right? So change time is commonly referred to as ctime, right? And I want you to think of ctime as like you're changing the characteristics of the file. You're not changing what's inside. And think of it like a package. So the ctime would be, I changed the address label on the outside of the package. That would be a ctime change. And so I'll just put down here, it's like, you know, you're changing the label on your package. And the characteristics could be the permissions. And that's kind of why I spent a little time talking about permissions. And I'll just abbreviate there. So the change time of the ctime is if we modify the label, the characteristics of the file, not the contents of the file. And then we've got the mod time, right? And so mod time is another one, or you can just think of it as modification time. But the mod time is not the label, it's changing the contents, what's inside my package. I'm not changing the address label. I'm actually either removing things from inside the package, maybe I'm putting some other things in, but I'm editing the contents. Oops, sorry, and hold on one second here before this locks out on me. I'm editing the contents of the file, right? And so you can think of this as permissions. I'm going to put this as the contents. We already did contents, and just repeat that, right? The contents. Changing the contents of the file. And then you have the access time, right? And this was, when was it? Think of it like, when did somebody last look at the contents of the package? When did they look in to see what's inside? What are the contents? And we'll think of it just like looking, right? And now I'm going to give you some concrete examples, and I apologize there. And that's our you think of it as A time or access time, and mod time, C time, right? So now let's take a look at some examples of what that might look like, right? So when you say ls and use the -L, the time that it's showing you, and I'm just going to leave, we'll work with the bottom part of the screen here. I'll leave this stuff all across the top here, and I want to leave the C time over here. So we're going to look at a file, right? So when I use ls, right? And actually we could even say ls, let's do this, ls-lt. And you see the time associated with a file. Well, it shows 1021. So, but what is that showing me? This is the modification time of the file. And again, it just so happens that that was when the file was also created, but don't confuse the creation time with the modification time. So when you use ls, right, it's showing you the mod time. When was the last time the contents were modified? So we see that 1021. But let's start out here first with C time, right? And I'm going to prove to you that the C time is different from the mod time, is different from the access time. And I'm going to show you how to see each of those times. And so here's how we're going to do that. So the C time, it's all about the label on the package, the characteristics of the package, and those characteristics could be permissions. So not going into the chmod or change mode command, I'm going to run a command here real quickly to change the permissions. I'm changing the C time, the label on the package, the characteristics about this file. And we'll say chmod 777 AA file. So now when I say ls-l, what do we see for AA file? We see 1021. Well, if I scroll back up here, what was the time that we saw up above earlier? We saw 1021. Because when I say ls-l, what is the time we're being shown? Is it the C time? No, it's the modification time, right? So the contents of my package weren't changed. The contents of my file weren't changed. The characteristics of the file were changed. And so that brings up the question, how do we see that time? Well, let's combine it with ls-ltc, right? And that lowercase c, and how could, if you didn't know that, you could say man ls. And if I came down to the lowercase c, you can see here, sort and show C time. That's what we're interested in. So ls-ltc, look at the difference here. There is the characteristic change of the file. That's the time that the C time is showing you. Because remember, that's very different from the time we see up here. Here's the modification time. When was the last time the contents of the file of the package were modified? 1021. when was the last time the characteristics of the file were changed? And you can see that it's 1035, right? Because that is when I changed the permissions. So that's our ctime, and that's how you see the ctime. ls dash, and I'm going to group it together here because we wanted to see our, have it all displayed, LTC, right? So we've got the ctime down. Now let's talk about what changes the modification time, right? But not the ctime. So to modify it, we need to change what's in the package, what's in the file. So how would I do that? Well, let's go ahead and I'm going to run a command here you might not be familiar with. I'm going to send the output of this concatenate command. In other words, it would display the contents of the host file. And what we're going to say is I'm going to send it into AA file, meaning whatever's in the host file is going to be appended to the end of AA file. Now, that just changed the contents. But let's do this. Let's run ls-ltc. That's the ctime value. And take a look at what happened. The characteristics changed. Specifically, the size of the file has changed. And so that does update the ctime when we modify the contents. But it also updates, in order to see the modification, is to just simply say ls dash, or if I were to show you ls-tc, we don't get that long listing. See, that's the problem. That's why we need the L in there. If I just said ls-l, you'll see that it represents that 1037 time that we saw. And let me scroll back up just a skosh. We saw it right up here, right? So the modification, modifying the file, updates the ctime as well, because again, characteristics, i.e. the size of the file, have been listed out. So not only do we see that the characteristics of the file have changed, the size of the file, but we also see that the modification, the contents of the file have been modified, right? So now let's take a look at the access, right? Now remember, the access is not the mod time. And so when we're talking about modification, we're talking about changing the contents. However, we want to know when it was last accessed. When did somebody look at the contents? And as you would assume, that's going to be your -u to see when it was last accessed. So let's say ls-ltu. And what do we get? Well, look at that. The time is very different. It's about 16 minutes ago, because that was the last time someone had looked into that file. And again, upon initial creation, that's the timestamp that's placed on the file. Now, how would we know that someone looked at the file? Well, if I was to say cat, in other words, show me the contents of AA file, so that's what's in the file, but now let's rerun that ls-ltu command and look at that. So it shows me that the access time of the file is changed. When someone accessed the contents, looked at the contents, it changes the time value when we use the -u with the L and the T. But what about the LTC? What is that going to show? Well, remember, we haven't modified the contents, right? And the ctime hasn't changed on the file. So that still shows 1037. So again, the time is something to pay very, very close attention to. So what if I just said ls-lt? And you can see, how is it listing those files out? With just the T, it's giving me the modification time, but it's also putting them in the time that the file, the most recently accessed file, is first, followed by the second most recently accessed, and then so forth and so on. So this is a great way for you to sort of orient yourself with how these things are being accessed. So then finally, let's talk about hidden files. And for that, we can clear our screen. And so for the hidden files are file names, and it could even be a directory that begin with a single period. So remember, we saw that A, the dash lowercase a. And now take a look at what we see. Well, that's interesting. We didn't see that before. Look at that. We don't see that up here in this output that's up here. I don't see .a file, and I don't see .A file, and I don't see .A dir. I don't see any of these things. It's because we use the -a. And a common approach is to say ls-la. Give me a long listing and show me every file name, whether it's hidden or not. And remember, the definition of a hidden file is that it begins with a single period. Because here's one that begins with a single period, but then is followed by a period. And briefly, we'll talk about these briefly here and go into much more detail later, but this dot by itself represents the current working directory. The dot represents the parent directory, or the directory immediately above the directory I'm in, and the directory I'm in is named DevNet. The directory immediately above that is represented here in shorthand with the squiggly, which simply means your home directory. That's shorthand meaning your home directory. But this is how you would show files that begin with the dot. The hidden files is use the lowercase a. What about that uppercase a? ls-uppercase a. Well, as you can see, that shows us much the same thing. So if we go back to the man page on ls, it says, do not list implied dot and dot, because these exist in every directory, even the root directory. And so if you were to do a queue here and we look at that, yeah, where is the dot and the dot? If I say ls-a, here's the dot and the dot over here. But with the capital A, we don't get the dot and the dot because maybe you don't want to see the sort of shorthand reference for the current working directory and the parent directory. Maybe those are things you don't want to see. So make sure that you're confident about your ability to take a look at output like this and answer a question that would be what command or what options with the ls command were used to produce that output. Or if I was to say ls-r, or let's say ls-lr, what command options were used with ls to produce that output? You know that the A is not going to be in there, capital or otherwise, or you may argue that, well, maybe there are no hidden files, and that's possible, but we know we have hidden files here. And so be competent in being able to examine the output without having the command and then being asked, what options are being used here? So here I listed things out in reverse alphabetical order. And again, if I clear my screen and we said ls-lut, you could look at that and say, oh, right, okay, so it's not being listed alphabetically. You can clearly see it's not an alphabetical listing. But when we look at the time column, there's something a little, weird about the time column. Oh, right, it's being listed in most recently accessed. Right? Remember that U is for the access. The ls-l by itself, that's the last time it was modified, right? So how would you kind of build your ls skill set? Create some files, use the touch command, make some directories with mkdir, and then take a look at the man page on ls. And the man pages are very, very good. They can be a little terse, but they are going to give you some options that are going to help you with learning this command. All right, let me go ahead and type Q to quit. And that is going to conclude this video tutorial, the first in many video tutorials that we're going to have as part of CTS-233, which is the DevASC or the Cisco Networking Academy DevNet Associate course, preparing you for the DevNet Associate CCNA exam. All right, thank you so much for watching. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.